Hello and welcome. In this video, we are going to take another introductory look at cascading style sheets, and specifically, we are going to take a look at how to utilize the HTML style tag in conjunction with CSS or cascading style sheets. This video is part of a larger series of videos focusing on HTML, CSS, JavaScript, and other technology related to intranet and internet application development. This video also assumes that you've watched some of the earlier videos focusing on things like HTML tags, such as the P tag, as well as the table tag. Now, to begin with, what we're going to do is we're going to look at the HTML style tag and understand a little bit about it. It turns out it can go multiple places in the document, although what we're going to do is we're going to put this in the head of the document. It's meant to be sort of a global style for this document. As we talked about in an earlier video, there are some advantages to inline styling, this global styling for a document, and then later on we'll take a look at how to push all of the style out to a separate file. There are also some disadvantages to each of the approaches, and what we're going to see is that this pushing of the style to a single location in the document has some strengths and also still has some weaknesses. So to begin with, what we want to do is we want to start off with a new HTML document. So the first thing I'm going to do is create a new HTML page. And for the title on this one, I'm just going to call this CSS, and then we're going to call this In Document, for lack of a better way of describing it. And again, I'm going to go ahead and do the same thing as I've done in the earlier videos. I'm just going to go ahead and create a H1 tag that has the same text. And before I forget, let's go ahead and split our view, and we can go ahead and save this particular document as our CSS in document, for lack of a better title for the page. All right, now what we're going to do is we're going to first start by setting up our style. So if you notice up here in the head, if you type in style or get started with style, in this case, Visual Studio will allow for you to auto-complete it. You have your open and close tags. And then what we can do is we can specify the style associated with one or more elements in the document. Now, the easiest one for us to start off with is, in fact, the ones that we already have, and that is our body and our H1. And so what I'd like to do is just keep this first example simple. I like to focus on the H1 tag, and I simply specify for the H1 tag, in this case, a color for the tag itself. So in this case, what I'm going to do is I'm going to specify color, and we'll pick something that's hopefully not going to be too hard on the eyes. But you can see here now that the H1 tag now is an aqua color. And while we're at it, let's have a little bit of fun with this. Let's go ahead and change the font size. And then we can, for instance, increase it. 100 is probably a little too large, but we'll go ahead and change it to 30 pixels. And you notice here that basically all I've done here, let's make it a little larger here. There we go. All I've done here is just separated out multiple different attributes or styles for the H1 tag, separated simply by a semicolon. And again, you'll notice here that we're simply identifying it as the H1 tag. Now, I can do the same thing with the body tag. As a matter of fact, I'm going to go ahead and change the background color just because I'd like to. You'll notice here I can just add another identifier here based on the tag body. And then what we'll do is we'll do the background color. And again, have some fun with this. Excuse me. I'm going to go ahead and make this, let's go with Azure. Hopefully that'll show up okay on your screen. And again, you can have some fun with this, have some fun exploring this. So now these are the two tags that we already had in our body, and those were the easiest ones to pick. Now what I'd like to do is I'd like to expand this out a little bit further. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to introduce a H2 tag. And we're just going to call this one example number 1. And we're going to repeat this a couple of times, maybe have an example number 1, example number 2, and so on. And you'll notice that it reverts back to whatever the default is for the H2 tag, in this case, the black text of a certain size. And what I'd like to do is I'd like to also include it in with some of the other styling. And so what I'd like to do here is I'd like to combine ultimately more than one of these elements to have the same style. Now, in this particular case, I have my H1 tag as having both the color aqua and the font size of 40 pixels. But if I were to add the H2 tag, that would mean that all of my headers were the same size. And so instead, what I want to do is I want to create a separate style for my H1 and my H2 tags. And I'm going to go ahead and specify the color being aqua. And I'm going to remove the coloration from the H1 tag. And you'll notice that now H1 gets the size of 40 pixels, and H1 and H2 both get the aqua color. And so you can see here how you can use a combination of tags to have a consistent document formatting, consistent document appearance. And we can again do this with any number of tags, and we'll go through some examples in just a second. Now, what I'd like to do is under this first example, I'm just going to go through, I'm going to create some P tags, nothing too fancy here. So this will just be a P tag. And again, whereas before we would have done some sort of inline styling, I'm just going to have this be sample text number 1. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to come along and I'm going to ID this as P1. In other words, that's the unique ID. You can also call it paragraph 1 if you want to, para 1. The idea is basically I'd like to identify some text in a unique manner. And I'm going to go ahead and follow this up with another tag, another P tag. Notice how it's warning me that I have the same ID for 2 tags, which I cannot do. So I now have a para 1 and a para 2. And then to make it easy on us, we'll go ahead and separate this or change the text here so we can see that one is sample text 1 and one is sample text 2. Now, what I'd like to do is I'd like to come up here to my style, and I'd like to now specify by the ID some property associated with the style. So in this case, what I'd like to do is I'd like to specify, you'll notice here the Visual Studio is already helping me out when I hit the pound sign. Using the para 1, basically what I'd like to do is perhaps again have the color. Color is just the easiest one for us to change. Let's look at some sort of red coloration for this. And then we can do the same thing now with the second one. So we'll say para 2, and then maybe for that one, then we'll specify a different color. Maybe we'll go with a nice green or gray even. Green should work. There we go. And you can see now that I have 2 different colorations for the different paragraphs based on the ID. Now, what I'd like to do is I'd actually also like to show you how you can do this based on a new attribute that we've not really talked too much about, and that is the class associated with an element. Turns out that you can group things not only by the type of element, but also by a class of element. And the simplest way for us to see that is just to go down here to our second example. We'll have another P tag, and this time around, we're going to specify a class. And I'm going to call this my warning class because for whatever reason, I want to have a warning message to the user. Do not do this. I suppose that's sending a conflicting message here. It's not meant that we shouldn't do this. It just means that that is how you would highlight the text in your document. I can also include an ID. And so keeping along with the pattern that we've established before, we'll call this one warn 1 for warning 1, and we'll do a second one for warning 2. But notice here it's not getting a prompt or a warning for using the same class name. And then we're going to change the text here to say also do not do this. Now, right now, both of those are currently in black and they're using the default 12-point text. And what I'd like to do now is I'd like to figure out a way how I can identify the warnings separate from the regular paragraphs that we saw above. And it turns out that you can simply just specify using the dot that you want to specify the class. In this case, I only have one class in this document, and that is going to be our warning class. And in our warning class, let's say that we wanted to do two things. We wanted to change the color to something a little more vibrant here. We'll go with color yellow. Oh, that's very hard to read. Maybe that's not the best choice here. Let's see what we've got. I think we can come up with something that's better than that. Let's see how that looks. That's also pretty hard to see. I may have to change my background color here to something. Again, I'm having fun with this. Hopefully you are as well. So I encourage you to just play around with your colors a little bit. There we go. That's not too bad. We can see that reasonably well. In addition to the hot pink coloration now, what I'd also like to do is I would also like to change the font size. And because it's intended to be a warning, let's go ahead and bump up the font size here. And let's go ahead and do one other thing that we have not yet explored, and that is let's go ahead and put a border around the warnings. And so we'll go ahead and make these double. And then to really layer this on here, we're going to go ahead and go with our background color. And for this one, we can, again, maybe change this to a different one. And again, this is turning into be a pretty hard to look at page here. But again, I'm having some fun with this. And again, I encourage you to do the same thing here. But you can see that what I've done now is I've grouped or selected elements based on a class. And so I can now create another P tag with a different class, and it will not fall under that style. However, anything that I choose to put under that class, so for instance, let's say I decide to do another H2 tag, and we'll go with example number 3. You'll notice that the H2 tag already has example number 3 in that aqua that we were using earlier because we specified this here. However, what I can do is I can also specify the class equal to the warning. And now suddenly it is overridden. So in other words, what was previously aqua, because it was H2, was redefined later by virtue of the fact that the class that it was under was the warning class. And so again, you can see here how you can sort of layer and play around with the styling using both the ID, class, and the element or tag names as well. Now, what I'd like to do is I'd like to finish this example off by going back to the earlier example that we did in a previous video that we sort of did the hard way, the painful way, and that was the alternating rows. And so what I'm going to do here is I want to mention real quick here. So this is our alternating rows example, and I'm going to do it one more time. This time, though, what we're going to do is we're going to be strategic about how we ID the elements in the table and how we class them. So again, we're going to start off with a simple table. I'm going to give it an ID that I'm going to call alternating. And from there, then what we're going to do is we're going to have no head and no body and no foot. We're just going to do it as rows. And we'll keep this one to a single column. So this is going to be row number 1. And right now, we have 2, 3, 4 rows. I'll clean up the text real quick. And especially with our background and with the rest of the stuff being rather obvious, this table down here looks pretty see real quick. Let me see if I can get this to refresh here real quick. Ah, interesting. Well, that's definitely a little different. I'm not terribly sure don't see any mistakes in my code. So let's just bounce out here to the file system. Let's go ahead and take a look at this one. There we go. Not really sure why the web server in Visual Studio crashed on me here. I will take a look at that later on. But we can continue with this video here. We'll just simply move out here to the web browser. You'll see there is my table. It's hard to see. It's hard to even know that it's a table. Really, the only way that you would know that it's a table is if you notice that extra space after each one of the numbers. And then also, of course, if you did Control U, you could see that there is a table, in fact, defined in there. What I'd like to do is I'd like to go back to the previous example where we had the alternating colorations and the border. And the way to do this is, of course, we could do inline styling, but instead what we want to do is we want to leverage a combination of this ID as well as the classes. And so if you recall from the previous example when we did this, we had to identify the border in both the table and the cell. And so what I would like to do is I would like to identify each of the cells by a class. And in this case, I'm going to call this one class odd because it is row 1. Actually, what we'll do is we'll put the class for the rows in the TR. So let me change that real quick. So for the odd row 1 and 3, and then class even for 2 and 4. And then for the columns, what I'll do is I'll just specify the class equal to column 1. So we'll do column underscore 1. And we will repeat this for all 4 of our columns in each of our rows. And now we have just enough identification in the table, in the rows, and in the columns to be able to style this easily. And so what we can do is we can first come up here to the top. We can specify based on the class. So notice here I have my dot. We can specify by the class. And there is our odd and our even. So we'll start off with the odd. And remember from the previous example that what we wanted to do is we wanted to color the rows in alternating colors. So what we'll do is we'll use either the color or the background color. Up to you what you want this to look like. And we'll alternate between aqua and aquamarine. So in other words, the odd rows will be aqua, the even rows for the background color will be aquamarine. And then what we'll do is for the alternating table ID, we'll specify that the border is going to be double. And rather than rewrite this again to leverage the column 1 class, we can just separate the selectors and again specify the column 1. I have to see what. All right, so I'm not sure why it wasn't automatically picking that up. I'm not seeing any issues with my spelling. We'll see if there's any problems here. But basically what that should do is that should then allow for us to have the double border surrounding the individual cells. Let's go ahead and save this real quick. We'll come back out here to Chrome, we'll refresh, and yes, for some reason it's not picking up that class. So we'll go back in here real quick and we'll change this. I don't see any issues right off bat. Let's just go ahead and duplicate this real quick. This should be fine, but when specified. So again, I'm not seeing my TD class of column underscore 01. All right, and so we'll again specify border double. Come out here and refresh this one more time. All right, so let's take just a second here, see if we can identify where my typo is. The fact that I'm not seeing the class for the columns. I think I see what I did wrong here. I think, yes. Okay, yes, using the wrong syntax here. So the ID for the alternating, and I had used the class down here. So in this case, we weren't looking for the ID. Instead, we were looking for the class. All right, and then there we go. Still not sure why my local host crashed on me. If we come over here to our web browser and refresh, now we should have our column 1 class for each of our cells. Now, that probably seemed like a fair amount of work for a simple example. However, the big advantage with this approach, by having all of the style at the top of the document instead of scattered throughout the page, is that you can then come up here and you can make a quick change. So for instance, let's say that your customer didn't like your aqua and aquamarine choices. So instead, what you would want to do is perhaps switch to something a little more palatable. There we go. We'll go with a crimson, and then maybe we'll see what we've got in terms of a light coral or something along those lines. But then if you come back here and you refresh it, then you only had 2 places you had to change it. You did, in fact, not have to change it in every single one of those rows. Now, there is one last example that I do want to show you, and that is there is one more wildcard behavior, if you would, and that is if you go here to your CSS selectors reference, we've covered the element. This is where we selected the H1 and possibly one of the P tags, but we've also covered the ID. That just means that you specify it using the pound sign. And then we have the ability to specify a class or even a set of classes. So for instance, either the dot intro in the example would have been ours with the even or the odd. And we could have also further narrowed this down. Instead of doing just dot even or dot odd, we could have said a TR dot even and TR dot odd in case we needed that granularity. But then the last thing that we want to take a look at are some of these CSS attribute selectors, and that basically this will allow for either further refinement. Now I'm just going to do one example here because again, there's all sorts of different possible combinations, especially when you start looking at nesting. This can get pretty sophisticated pretty quick. But the idea is that you would be able to create a combination of rules in your styling that then would cover all of the elements and how you wanted to style them appropriately. And the one that we're interested in is this last one here. This selects all elements with an href attribute value containing the substring W3 schools. Now, of course, we aren't necessarily looking for an href attribute. Instead, this could be any attribute, and then it could look for any substring. And so the idea here is, if we take a look at that, you effectively will look at what the tags are, or the attributes are rather, in your HTML code. And if you can find some sort of pattern where there's a matching substring, then you can simply leverage that so that you can apply a rule to all of them. And so if you come back over here to our HTML code, what I'd like to do is I'd like to further refine our warning if you notice here, we have our Warren underscore 01 and Warren underscore 02. And previously what we had done is we had identified it by the warning class. Well, it turns out that we can filter it even further by using these wildcards. And again, if you come over here to the documentation real quick, you'll see that basically what we can do is we can specify some attribute. In this case, it's going to either be the class or the ID. In our case, we're going to use the ID. And you'll notice that the way that we've named this, all of the IDs start with Warren. And so what I'd like to do is I'd like to set up a rule so that what we're going to do is we're going to look for ID that matches WARN. In other words, or rather has that as a substring. And then at this point, then we just need to come up with whatever behavior we want. In other words, how do we want to modify the warning? And so if you come over here one more time and we'll look at our document. And so the idea then maybe is that you want to change something else about this document based just simply on the fact that it has an ID of WARN. Now, if you recall, when we created this third example here, this example number 3, we did not give it a warning ID. And so if you come back over here, you'll see that our example number 3 has a class of warning. And so effectively what we're going to do is we're going to exclude any behavior that we're going to apply to the 2 paragraph tags with warn 1 and warn 2. We're going to exclude that behavior in our H2 and that third H2. And so what we can do, for instance, is we can further change the background color. Maybe we decided that we don't in fact want that to be black, so we can override it. And what we would do is we'd pick a different background color. Let's not go with blue. I think we've already used blue. Maybe we'll go with a dark goldenrod. And then now if we don't have any typos in this, we haven't made any mistakes, then when we come back through here and we refresh this, you'll notice that only the 2 P tags that have an ID that match the pattern of WARN or have a substring of WARN in them will be affected by that selector. Now, this can get very, very sophisticated very quick. Just thought I would show you that you have a lot of control over your styling. The point with this video isn't to show you all the different possibilities. It's to show you that by aggregating all of the style at the top of the document or in one location, then you can improve on what we saw in the earlier video with the inline styling. You do still have to be careful with your tags, with your IDs and your class so that you can figure out how to appropriately group it, because otherwise you're not really going to be taking advantage of having the style at the top of the document. Basically, consistent coding, consistent naming, and aggregating at the top will save you a lot of time. So as always, if you have any questions, comments, or concerns, don't hesitate to reach out to me. And thank you for watching.